It's our belief that an informed public is more likely to support effective human rights and social justice policies. And in that regard, I want to really recognize this effort by the Tennessee Commission on Human Rights. I hope you're setting a model that other state commissions will follow of soliciting input from organizations around the state, holding hearings in 5 cities. I hope I get to come to another one, but that my plane comes on time. I also just want to note at the outset, being somebody from out of state, how meaningful it is to me to be in Memphis just a few weeks after the holiday celebrating and honoring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who gave his life in this very city, advocating for striking sanitation workers. Dr. King knew way ahead of most of us that civil rights were human rights and that this was a global endeavor. He spoke eloquently in moral terms about the universality of human rights and the dignity of all human beings. Today, nearly 46 years later, we still face challenges to advancing civil and human rights for all Americans. Unfortunately, we still see resistance to many policies and laws that would make America more just and more equitable, particularly in Washington, D.C. You are all no doubt familiar with the gridlock in the aptly named Do Nothing Congress. While our national legislature continues to succumb to partisan obstruction and paralysis, the economic and social needs of most Americans are more pressing than ever before. The top 1% of earners in America earn more than 19% of the nation's household income. The unemployment rate for African Americans nationally is nearly twice the national average. And for young people, it's nearly 3 times the national average. Overall, in the data that I found, Tennessee has an average unemployment rate of 7.8%, which is higher than the national average. And from the latest poverty data, the poverty rate in Tennessee was 17.9%, almost 3% higher than the national average. African Americans and people of color are overrepresented, if you will, in these categories. Clearly, there remains an inconsistency between the ideals the nation professes and the reality of its practices. While it's true that U.S. laws and policies are comparatively advanced in protecting civil rights, the gaps in U.S. law and policy recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is striking, especially in the areas of racial discrimination and economic inequality. The U.S. government has fallen short of fully implementing its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. These are the 2 major human rights conventions that the U.S. has ratified. And other major human rights conventions, like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, the need for which I will highlight later in my presentation, the U.S. is among a minority of nations that has failed to ratify these important conventions. In our work on national policy, we are very conscious that bipartisan support is essential for achieving success. While one party may be able to block action, it takes 2 parties to advance social change. Recently, we have seen some progress in this regard. Looking back over the past year in the Congress, we've seen the adoption of a bill reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, which was signed into law, and the adoption in the Senate of a comprehensive immigration reform bill. And just 2 weeks ago, I'm pleased to report, there was a bipartisan introduction of a new voting rights bill that embodies a forward-looking set of protections that overall will ensure an effective response to racial discrimination in voting in every part of the country. But these examples of progress are not mere coincidence, nor did they come easily. That's why my colleague, Anjali Thakur Mittal, who's sitting back here and has been with you all morning, came to Memphis today for this hearing. The case for advancing human rights and civil rights here in Tennessee and the nation is clear. Lifting up those who are excluded or stuck at the bottom benefits us all. But achieving this requires us all to work together. We face many challenges to advancing the cause of human rights and perfecting our union. But I would urge all of us, whether we are civil and human rights advocates, public servants in the government, or members of the Tennessee Congressional Delegation, which includes some very important members of the House and Senate, to rededicate ourselves to finding common ground, to reach solutions that benefit the people in Tennessee and around the country. Like I said, in my written testimony, I will get into some of these issues in more detail, but here I just want to be very brief, beginning with voting, because that's such a fundamental human right. As you know, the Voting Rights Act was first enacted in 1965 and has been reauthorized 4 times, each time with bipartisan support. In June last year, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in Shelby County, and I want to make it clear it was in Alabama, not Tennessee, Shelby County v. Holder, that the coverage provided by the Voting Rights Act in Section 4B used to determine the states and political subdivisions subject to Section 5 preclearance was unconstitutional. While the court did not invalidate the preclearance mechanism of the voting rights, it effectively halted its use by invalidating that part of the law that determined which places were subject to the preclearance requirement. The Leadership Conference was part of a coalition effort working with a group of bipartisan congressional leaders committed to quickly addressing the court's decision. And like I said, just 2 weeks ago, a bipartisan group of members of Congress introduced amendments to the Voting Rights Act that will help restore the fair and effective protection of every American's right to vote. We are hoping that the strong bipartisan support will enable this new amendment to the Voting Rights Act to be enacted in time for the 2014 election. We hope we can count on the advocates here in Tennessee and the Tennessee Congressional Delegation to support this fair and common sense legislation. We also believe that bipartisan support has opened the possibility of reform of our criminal justice system at both the federal and state level. In fact, just last year in Tennessee, I believe overcrowding of state prisons made headlines across the state. It was reported that in the Nashville City paper that 10 of the 14 prisons have operated above 95% of their capacity on average since July 2012. As a result, the state was forced to house over 9,000 of its inmates in county jails at an additional cost of $48 million to taxpayers. And I think you know the statistics that a disproportionate number of African American men are in prison, often for drug offenses where the laws are being changed now because of the draconian penalties. A number of states, including Texas and Arkansas, have been taking steps to implement policies that are alternatives to incarceration, like probation, community supervision, use of GPS tracking devices, and other means to reduce their prison population and reduce costs while protecting public safety. We would urge Tennessee to look at the alternatives that these states and others are pursuing, as well as proposals at the national level that will create more equity and lower the costs of incarceration, and also make it easier for people who are in prison when they're released to re-enter the community by continuing to build ties with their families and provide education and job training. I was going to talk about education, but the woman who preceded me was so eloquent and gave such detailed comments. I just want to add that it is in our experience, in looking at the same data of the Office for Civil Rights, this is a national problem, but it's also a state problem. And the only thing I would add to what she said at the very end, is that the excessive discipline and zero tolerance policy has a disproportionate effect on African Americans and other people of color, but also specifically on people with disabilities, and particularly students of color with disabilities. So I would just urge that in looking at this issue, you be sure to include students with disabilities as well as students of color. And I also will leave with you a report that the Leadership Conference submitted to the Human Rights Council in Geneva where they're considering the U.S. compliance with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's called Still Segregated, How Race and Poverty Stymie the Right to Education. Because when talking about excessive suspensions from school, it's implicit that this has an impact on students' learning. And again, we don't have time to get into the achievement gap, but this is a gap in achievement, again, between students of color and white students that is evident from national data and also from some data here in Tennessee, which we will include in our written testimony. So let me turn to the rights of people with disabilities, because this is an issue important here in Tennessee and important in the nation, and of course, in talking about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, it's important to people all over the globe. I know that you've heard from NICL, which is one of the organizations that has been very active in the coalition to try to get the Senate to ratify the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. The Leadership Conference and the Education Fund has a long history of working to advance the rights of people with disabilities, helping to pass legislation containing strong disability protections, such as the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADA amendments of 2008. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was inspired by and embodies the bedrock American ideals that form the basis of the Americans with Disabilities Act: non-discrimination, equality, accessibility, and respect for the inherent dignity of all persons, including persons with disabilities. This non-discrimination treaty seeks to ensure that countries around the globe provide people with disabilities with the same rights as everyone else, so that they can live full, satisfying, and productive lives. The CRPD has been ratified by 141 countries. It was negotiated by the George W. Bush administration and signed by President Obama in 2009. You have two senior and very important senators who will vote on this treaty. In addition, Senator Bob Corker is now the ranking minority member on the Foreign Relations Committee, which has to approve the treaty for ratification before the full Senate can vote. Unfortunately, Senator Corker announced his opposition to the treaty just before Congress adjourned in December. We need his support to advance this human rights treaty for people with disabilities. Tennessee has a higher than average percentage of people with disabilities. As his constituents, your voices are very important. In fact, we really can't get it done without you. I have to say, one of the, I guess, rewarding parts of my being on endless airplanes since last night was I started to talk to the woman who was sitting next to me on the plane. And she was from South Carolina and returning from New York, and told me she had been in New York because her son, Kyle Carpenter, had been in Afghanistan, and he was being recognized as a hero because he threw himself on top of the body of his buddy when a grenade went off, and he'd spent 3 years in a rehabilitation hospital, and he will be disabled for the rest of his life. And when she asked me what I was going to do in Tennessee, I told her I was coming to this hearing and that I wanted to talk about the Treaty on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and she was like, I can't understand, how could anybody be against it? And it was really hard for me to explain to her why anybody would be against this treaty, and to really be able to understand the pain that she as a mother has been through. So I had a more formal ending, but having had that experience, I wanted to share her story, because I think so often we don't think about the individual human beings and what they're experiencing, and it's easy in this instance to say, oh, it's from the UN, it's some body out there that's going to tell us what to do, but actually it can make a real difference for people with disabilities, whether they're injured in war or accidents or anything, in terms of their own accessibility. We in the US have been pioneers. Of course we can improve, but when people with disabilities travel abroad, they face really serious obstacles, and this treaty would help address them. So we need your support. We want to continue to work with you here in Tennessee. We think what the Commission is doing is really outstanding, and I thank you for including us in today's event.
was right, I forgot.
Would you articulate your answer to her of what's the conservative position against it? It's got to be related to employer money, I'm assuming, but more than that.
Actually, it's not related to money. In fact, just as with the ADA, there's a lot of business support for this treaty. The Chamber of Commerce supports it, and other business organizations, because they see it as an opportunity to export U.S. technology, which really has been pioneering in terms of accessibility, particularly technology companies or communications companies, so it's not a cost issue. I'd say the main issues are about the role of the UN in general. It's not specific to this treaty, it's to all treaties, and the fear, because it really, there is nothing concrete in the treaty or in our experience with other treaties, but the fear that somehow it will undermine U.S. sovereignty, that some other institution or group of people will tell us what to do. And I'm trying to be as objective as...
America, so.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to articulate it as objectively as I can, but they would even say, and they did say at the hearings, well, it's not that there's anything in the treaty, but it possibly could happen.
All right, so Mr. Corker represents Tennessee, and you may or may not know, Memphis, Tennessee is probably the center of the prosthesis industry business. We've got Wright Medical, we've got Medtronics, we've got human technology.
Wow.
Memphis
Okay,
is one of the manufacturing centers of the kinds of things that we would be exporting to other countries.
Memphis needs to say that to him, Johnson.
Yeah, and a group of activists from Tennessee, organized by the Tennessee Coalition on Disabilities, recently came to Washington to talk with him about how important they viewed the treaty, and his responses and then his chief of staff were all about legal issues.
I'm sorry, about what?
Legal issues. Again, the sovereignty or states' rights, that some entity might tell states what to do. It was not a bit, either money or those kinds of things that you might usually expect. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. I missed your name.
June Zeitlin, and she is on the agenda. She is with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is located in Washington, D.C. Thank you, June.